I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I want to welcome you to this Sticky Center event on A Revolution Underway, how attention to gender issues is transforming international development. And although there's only a dedicated few here today, I want to thank you all for coming. I was of a mind of Bob Dylan earlier when I was thinking that the wind was howling and the snow is outrageous, and I'm glad you all fought through it to get here. I'm especially grateful to our speaker today, Carla Koppell, for trekking up here from balmy Washington. I knew Carla was our kind of speaker when she told me that she would combine her visit to Dartmouth with a weekend of both cross-country and downhill skiing with her son, who is studying Boston.
Which was awesome.
So as economists from Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, on down, and from policymakers ranging from Hillary Clinton to IMF Chairman Christine Lagarde have said gender matters. Investment in the empowerment of women, in the education of women and girls, and improving the legal status of women, all of these things provide extraordinary benefits in terms of poverty alleviation, reduction of high fertility rates, and positive social change. And it's for this reason that the World Bank, national development agencies throughout the West and other parts of the world, and international NGOs have made women's empowerment a top priority. Western governments, or at least many of them, some of us are backsliding, are increasingly pressing efforts to deepen the involvement of women in conflict resolution, democracy promotion, countering extremism. So there are many reasons for all these developments. The first is that gender equality is not just a parochial concern of half the world's population, it's a human right. It's a concern for all of us. And as Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland and the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, put it, no society can develop economically, politically, or socially when half of its population is marginalized. The other reason, or another reason why this is also important, is that it works. Research has underscored that societies that discriminate by gender tend to experience less rapid economic growth, less poverty reduction, and less improvement overall than societies that treat males and females more equally. Social gender disparities produce economically inefficient outcomes. One example that scholars have held up is that if African countries had closed the gender gap in schooling between 1960 and 1992 as quickly as East Asia did, they would have produced close to a doubling of per capita income growth in the region. So how is gender being taken into account? I'm delighted that here to speak with us today is Carla Koppell, who has been at the heart of this revolution. She is now a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown University Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. You all remember when we had Milan Verveer here, and that is otherwise known as the Verveer Institute. She has been Chief Strategy Officer of the United States Agency for International Development. She was also the first, right, Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment at USAID. She has been a Vice President of the U.S. Institute of Peace, Director of the Institute for Inclusive Security, and she even served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department for Housing and Urban Development. She has extensive work with the Food and Agriculture Organization and with many other institutions. She holds an undergraduate degree from Cornell and a master's in public policy from Harvard. And again, I'm really thrilled that she made this long trip up here in the dead of winter. So welcome.
Thanks. Thank you to everybody, and I know the temperature is dropping. We observed that walking back from one of our meetings today, so I appreciate your coming out despite the cold. And to those, I know there are a few of you who were in the earlier conversation that I did in one of the classes on campus, and there will be a little bit of repetition of things which were in that class. Forgive me, there will be a lot of stuff which is new and different, I promise, and thank you for coming to speak with me again this afternoon. So I came into USAID And as Dan mentioned, I was the first senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment. And actually, a nice Dartmouth connection, I had been brought in by Ambassador Don Steinberg, who I know was here for some period of time and spoke with this group as well, to be part of a small core of people to look at and transform the way that gender was handled within the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I arrived with a lot of fanfare. They took advantage of my arrival to move people into different positions. They had a big manifesto from the administrator talking about how things were always going to be very different, and that we were going to change the way development assistance was delivered. At the time, there was a small Office of Women in Development, which had good, solid, but very boutique projects working in niche areas around the world with very few beneficiaries. And that was the way it had always been. I had actually been at USAID earlier during the Clinton administration. So I arrived there in around 1994. So 1994 to about 1999, and there had been a WID office. And the WID office was operating under exactly the same gender policy that was in place when I arrived in 2010. And I sat down. My first work was a listening tour. So I went to meet with people who were heading the various offices and the various bureaus to talk to them about what my mandate was. And there was one question that kept coming up in almost every meeting. Where are you going to focus work? Are you going to focus on Asia? Are you going to focus on Africa? Are you going to focus on the Middle East? Are you going to do environmental sector work? Are you going to do energy efficiency, agriculture, health? What are you going to do? And I didn't understand at the time why they were asking that question, because here had been my mandate was this broad mandate. And then I realized that it was because they didn't have any idea of the kinds of things Dan was just talking about how much in terms of development gains was being left on the table because we weren't paying attention to gender issues and women's empowerment issues. And so when we were debating the title, Dan's title, Revolution Underway, what I realized after those conversations was that this was a bit of a revolution in the way to think about these issues, because it really meant doing business entirely different, albeit totally nonviolent revolution. But it was going to mean big changes. So why did I believe that this was important? Well, over time, we've seen significant progress in the international case for gender equality. There's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which has been ratified by every country except 2, including the United States. That's a different story. There's Universal Declaration on Human Rights. There's UN Security Council Resolution 1325. How many people are familiar with that Security Council resolution? So UN Security Council, a few, brave, wonderful few. It's a path-breaking Security Council resolution that called for women's inclusion in all aspects of the peacemaking process, passed in 2000, and then was followed by 7 or 8 subsequent resolutions backing up that analysis of how important women were to peace building. And now, most recently, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which had not been adopted when I joined USAID. There are 17 of them. Number 5 is gender equality. But actually, what's in some ways equally, if not more interesting, is that gender is supposed to be a part of all 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's supposed to be both a standalone objective and a fundamental underpinning of the entire process of ending extreme poverty. So you could make a very good case based on international law. You can certainly make a tremendous case based on ethics, morals, and all of those are absolutely valid. But what was really striking to me coming into that position was that the data and evidence was absolutely overwhelming and has grown increasingly overwhelming over time. I first noticed it actually in the 1990s when there was something called the Arab Human Development Report, and it was talking about the trajectory for development in the Arab states. And it said that unless the Arab states made progress empowering their women, there would be economic stagnation. Not much changed. But the report was absolutely seminal. It was the first time that I saw a discussion that was broadly transformative in that way. It didn't talk about women's rights as being important because they're human rights. It didn't talk about women's rights being important because of these international laws. What it talked about was how essential it was to the development of those nations. And that wasn't to take away any credit from those moral, ethical, and legal arguments. It was to add to it. And since then, the data is only increasingly compelling. So we now know that greater gender inequality is correlated with greater perceived and actual corruption, more violence, higher rates of disease, and lower life expectancy, in addition to other things. And we know that greater gender equality results in higher outcomes for reductions in child mortality, increased expenditures on social welfare, and greater trust in government. But that's a very nice set of taglines. What we need to do is actually peel back the onion a little bit further to really understand the clear programmatic case. Wow, that resolution is really poor, I apologize. For advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. What we now know is unbelievable if you go sector by sector. So for example, in the education sector, you have a 10% increase in income for every year that a girl is in school. And every girl that's in school for another year then touches and improves the well-being of 6 people in her family. Why is that? That's because women invest 90% of their income back into the family and social welfare, whereas men invest 30 to 40%. They're investing in other things, not necessarily bad things, but they're not doing the kinds of social investment that result in the kinds of outcomes that we were talking about earlier. We also know that a 10% increase in girls' education increases GDP in a country by 3%. So even if you're not interested in the status of women and girls per se, you can be interested in the economic well-being of these countries and societies. We also know in the agriculture sector, for example, that if women had equal access, equal to men, to credit, land, inputs, markets, we could increase agricultural productivity by 20% globally, which would have dramatic implications for food security, another of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we know that from a purely pragmatic effort to advance development around the world, we need to close the gaps between men and women. Even when you look at a firm level, that is an industry level, you see the difference when you empower women and take their issues, their concerns, and their priorities in mind. Companies, and this is global, so it's developing and developing countries, countries in the top quartile for gender diversity, so 25% best gender representation on their boards, are 15% more likely to have returns above the median. So that diversity delivers on an individual industrial level as well. So this is a purely pragmatic case. And we can look at this across all different kinds of sectors. But there's another purely pragmatic case that also plays into this analysis, was what is the cost associated with the issues that plague women and girls around the world? Well, the first is we have an absolute epidemic of violence. We know that there are many different forms of gender-based violence around the world. We know that the prevalence rates vary from country to country, but that overall, 1 in 3 women will face some sort of violence in her lifetime. In places like Egypt, 98% of women report having been harassed. And globally, it's an unbelievable statistic. 50% of the homicide victims, female homicide victims, were killed by people they knew, whereas it's only less than 6% for men. 1/2 of all the victims of murder. We know that 130 million women are still victims of female genital mutilation. We know that 1 in 7 girls marries before 15. That's 650 million women globally, 12 million women per year. And while there are obvious consequences for the individual, there are also exceptional consequences for society. So the economic costs of this gender-based violence, and again, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about the cost for the individual, and I'm not saying we shouldn't care about this for purely moral reasons. But we also now know that the economic costs associated with violence against women and gender-based violence are 2% of global GDP, $1.2 trillion, equivalent to the economy of Canada. In the United States, we know that it costs $5.8 billion, Canada $1.16 billion, in the United Kingdom $32.5 billion in loss. So you may think, well, how can that possibly be? Well, the reason is because this violence has an inordinate impact on the society. Think about the lost labor, the lost income, the lost productivity, the lost labor. There are also less obvious connections. So for example, I had an Ethiopian colleague who worked with me, and she came to the United States because her parents sent her to go to school and high school in the United States because they didn't feel that they could send her safely to school in Ethiopia. Why? Because the school was too far away from her home and they were worried she would be kidnapped and married off as a child. Imagine all the girls, and we don't have the proper quantification, but imagine these norms that interfere with schooling. And we do know that while the gap in primary education has closed between girls and boys, we know that there's a yawning gap in secondary ed. And so we have to think about all of these issues and then prioritize on the basis of all of the factors that come into play when we talk about why we're losing an incredible asset base by not dealing with the issues that this large segment of society is facing. And you can see when we're talking about something like education that there's a vicious spiral at work, right? Because if people are dropping out of school, we're then undermining their earning potential and their potential to reinvest because we're worried about issues related to gender-based violence. So this violence drains public services, healthcare, the judicial system, social services. Now, compounding this issue of the epidemic of violence and further creating issues for the advancement of women are the legal barriers. So of about 195 countries in the world, 128 still have legal impediments to progress with economic empowerment for women. And you can get a sense of the kinds of impediments that you see. And there's a really interesting report, Women, Business, and the Law, by the World Bank that goes country by country and talks about where the changes are. But those barriers are blocking countries from fulfilling their economic potential. And that's why the World Bank is invested in collecting this data, because they say these are the things that you need to do in order to unleash the economic potential in your society. Similarly, we face extreme levels of marginalization in areas like peace building. And you've heard some about this from Don and Milan. I won't talk too much about it. But what we know now is that in peace negotiations overall, women represent approximately 2.4% of the mediators, and actually, interestingly, they're also 2.4% of the negotiators. So imagine your average society in which you have approximately half, although war-torn societies, often it's a large majority of the population is female. And yet when you're talking about making peace, you have 2.4% of the people who are involved that are making the decisions about how to negotiate for an end to that conflict. Similarly, when you look at constitutional reform, which is often coming after conflict, so you now have a peace accord and you're revising your constitution, only 1 in 5 drafters was a woman. So what is the likelihood you're going to compensate for those legal restrictions in the development of your new constitution? Much reduced. So those are a big set of barriers. And all of those costs and opportunities that I've run through for you combine with an extraordinary value add that is non-quantifiable that we should be thinking about when we are talking about how to move the revolution around women's empowerment forward. So this is the former first female president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, former first female president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, first democratically elected female president in Africa. And they represent actually progress in the area of women's empowerment. They came to power relatively recent past, and they're part of a trend that indicates that women in parliament has actually nearly doubled in the last 20 years globally. And actually the number is now about 24%, and we saw in the United States a big jump after the last election. So women are now about 24% of parliaments around the world, and that's great news. If you look at the list, you can see who's leading. Some of them are not the usual suspects, many of them. And what we know about these countries and what we know about these parliaments is that when parliaments are over 30% female, you tend to get countries that are more egalitarian, democratic, and inclusive. Now, it's a correlation, but there is that connection, which is really interesting, because what it means is you can turn it into a virtuous cycle, right? If you translate women's empowerment into something you're driving forward, you actually get knock-on benefits in the other things we're talking about, because those societies invest 3.8% more in social welfare. So you begin to get some of the benefits we were talking about earlier from making investments in these areas. Now, in addition to changing spending, and there's really great research from the panchayat level in India that looks at how the spending priorities shift when women come into office. There was a quota that was put in place. They studied who these women were, and then looked at how budgets and allocations changed, made really interesting look at how they then invested in water, in different kinds of infrastructure, and in different kinds of enterprises, and had a positive effect on the perception of girls within the community. So they not only changed the spending, but they also made girls expect more, and they made their parents expect more from girls. So it had an important perception effect. You also see differences in the laws that are passed. So in Pakistan, the Women's Caucus passed 7 different laws against gender-based violence where there had been none. And that was because those were the issues that they felt, and they felt were important and were under-legislated in the process of legislating. But that's women in governance. So let's turn our attention then to the development process. Now, I gave you the statistics on what would be gained in some sectors from an investment in development, but you can also see how it has manifest importance for the way projects are designed. So these are some women, Bangladeshi women, and there was a project that CARE had put together, which was really interesting because it mixed together different investments. So it was trying to improve nutrition for kids. And in doing so, it said, well, some families, we're going to give you improved seed varieties to plant. Some families, we're going to give you technical assistance on how to run your farm and your land. Some families, we're going to give nutrition education. Some families, we're going to give women's empowerment lessons and training in how women can find their voice, working with families and the women themselves. And then we're going to mix and match those interventions. And the project was very successful. The stunting rates for the kids declined, about 3 or 4%. What was interesting, there were 2 findings that were particularly interesting, though. The first finding was that the most powerful impact on the stunting was the women's empowerment. And that was interesting, right? So it wasn't the seeds, it was enabling these women to have a voice and to have some agency within their own home. But the second part was, to me at least, even more interesting, because all of the interventions were successful, but when you combined women's empowerment with any other intervention, that intervention was even more successful. So why was that important to me? Well, it was important to me because what it said was that investing in empowerment was like an accelerant. If they hadn't studied the impact of these different interventions being put together, we would have said this project was successful. 4% decrease in stunting, let's go home, it's great. And yet what they actually discovered was they were leaving whole percentages, right, of results on the table. And they wouldn't have even known it had they not been looking at what the differentiated impact was in these different areas. I saw how it changes people's perception to focus on these issues around gender norms as well when I was in Jordan, where I talked with a gentleman who ran the energy efficiency project, and he said, I suddenly realized I need female energy auditors. I said, okay, why? He said, well, I'm going around to households all day. I send people out, and these energy auditors are all men, but the women can't let in the men because they're at home alone. So now I understand. This is why it matters to me as an energy efficiency expert. He said, yeah, women's empowerment is nice too, but really what I want is to sell compact fluorescent light bulbs. So he was convinced because he saw what it meant in terms of his project, in terms of his work, and the things that were important to him. What we also know is if we turn to peace building, and I won't spend too much time on this, but that we see much more successful peace processes. So you'll remember that 2.4% figure I gave before. That is at the cost of peace negotiations. So we now know that when women are really participating in these negotiations, they're 35% more likely to succeed. And when we look at the number of negotiations that have really been intransigent and intractable over the last several years, we wonder, why is it that we're not involving these folks in this process? So for me, when I sat down at AID and everybody asked me where I was going to focus my attention, I realized what the problem was, and I realized I didn't have a choice. That it wasn't really about figuring out how to work on the margins. I wasn't going to be able to do this retail. I couldn't go to every energy efficiency expert in the agency and explain to him or her why this mattered in those terms. It needed to be a wholesale transformation in terms of the way we think about these issues and appreciate them as fundamental gains in the development field. And I pause because I would say development and peace building field because I think they go together, and increasingly we see fragile states and developing states as one of the same. But let's focus for a second on development. So what did we do to move this forward? And this is a little bit of the nitty-gritty of the revolution. First of all, we created these gender policies. And I mentioned that the previous gender policy had been in place for about 30 years. Maybe it's not quite that long, but a really long time. And we then also created the strategies to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which refers back to UN Security Council Resolution 1325, as well as a vision for ending child marriage. Those were then interwoven and synergistic with strategies that were not focused on gender or women's issues, but were important to them. So things like the Action Plan for Vulnerable Children, the education strategy, LGBT policy, the monitoring evaluation policy, to think about how you could create a net and a web that would enable people to understand why this was so important and give them the tools to move it forward and the carrots and sticks to enforce progress in that regard. What else did we do? Those are just policies. Well, we created rules for contracting. We created internal affinity groups to talk about why this mattered and to give a voice to the people inside the agency who cared about all these issues. We designated point people, and we held leaders accountable for implementing the policies and appointing the point people. We did a vast amount of outreach, internally and externally. So we had something called a drumbeat. Every month, people needed to hear across the agency about why this mattered, and people needed to hear outside the agency that we were working on it and why it mattered. I remember, for example, we got these security tips that popped up every day. They said, hold the handrail because it can be slippery. Things like that. They like that. And I said, well, why can't, during the 16 J's against gender violence, why can't we replace the tips and put tips about gender violence? And he said, oh, you can't do that. We could never do that. I mean, the tips are the security tips. So I went to the head of security, and I said, well, could we replace the tips? He said, Carla, that's a great idea. I hate those tips. They're so stupid. It's the same tips over and over again. And lo and behold, we had these tips going up every day for 16 days every year. And so it was about repetition and driving the message home and driving that message home backed up by data and evidence. So what happened? Well, I had gender focal points around the world coming up to me and thanking me for giving them some value for the jobs that they've been doing and giving them voice within their field offices around the work that they were doing. I had leaders in contracting firms, interestingly, saying to me, we just lost a contract because our work on gender wasn't up to snuff in our bid proposal. And I wanted to thank you because losing that contract gave me the opportunity to say to my people, we've got to do better. And it was the excuse that I needed to be able to get my folks on my team to take this seriously. We had increased chatter and discussion of the issues. We did film series, and we also had more young people interested in the agenda. It validated the agenda not to make it a sideline. It had always been, frankly, junior female staff who had been assigned this responsibility without any authority. And suddenly it became something we could do. And this was not just me. This was Don. This was Secretary Clinton. This was Milan Verveer that suddenly said this issue, this agenda matters. And the fact that you're doing this as part of your professional track matters. And it really made a difference. So today, what we actually see is a pretty good bipartisan consensus agenda. This administration has signed the Women, Peace, and Security Law. It's only one of 2 countries in the world that has a law implementing a commitment to women, peace, and security. We have the WeFi initiative at the World Bank, which was started under this administration to remove some of the economic barriers and increase financing for women's economic empowerment. There's a new Women's Economic Empowerment Act that was signed into law at the end of 2018. And you may have just seen that there's a brand new Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative that was launched by the White House and USAID very recently to move this agenda forward. Now, obviously, that's just a small step. But what it's indicative of is a process that started actually before I was working on these issues, because some of you may recall when the US invaded Afghanistan, there was actually a fair bit of noise about the disadvantages that women under the Taliban had faced in Afghanistan, and that was a Bush administration focus. And that focus was galvanizing. That, and I worked a lot with the people in the Bush administration who were focused on that agenda. That then translated into ramped up and extended commitment under the Obama administration, which has now been carried forward in this administration, thankfully. And so we see the codification and progress on an agenda, which is a bipartisan agenda, interestingly. And when you go up to Capitol Hill and talk to people, they're actually thrilled to have something that they can work on together that is a bipartisan agenda. There's a Congressional Women's Caucus. That caucus has been in place for decades. There's a lot of activity going on. Now, there's a long road still to travel, and I want to, and I could tell you chapter and verse about the things there are still left to do. But we have moved, I think, the agenda forward. Now, I was having a similar conversation with my husband recently and talking about the progress that has been made. And he said, well, did you see the tweet? I said, no. Which tweet? He said, well, the Dubai and the Emirates have started gender awards. And I said, that's great. Why? Yeah, lots of people have gender awards. And he said, well, look at who they have made the awards to. Now, gender is something about men and women. And supporting gender balance, creating the best federal entity for supporting gender balance, and the best initiative for supporting gender balance are great. But there's a bit of a problem with all the award recipients. And he said, so I think as much as we can declare that there's been progress, there are perhaps some issues that are still out there. So I would conclude, and I welcome a conversation and your comments and discussions about how we carry this forward and how I can clarify what I've said. But I would say at the end of the day, if there's one tagline to take from this conversation forward, is that it's about sustainable, durable development that lifts all boats in society. It's about what's doing right and what's smart. And it's about women and girls, but really it's about societies as a whole. So I thank you, and I welcome a discussion. And there are microphones for anybody who wants to have questions or make a comment. Do they come to you or do you go to them? Okay, this gentleman.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm wondering, without trying to force all of these issues into one aspect or another, I'm wondering about the cause and effect. Just to use the example of the women on the boards of companies, higher profits. Is that because the women are on the boards, or is it because a company who would do that operates in a way that they are more profitable?
So you picked probably the best one because the private sector has invested a lot in studying the issues of diversity and inclusion on their own because they want to understand this. And what the literature tends to say is that it is because the women are there, but it's simple market knowledge, right? So if you have a diverse board, you are better wired into different market segments, and you have more knowledge of the preferences and predilections of different groups within society, different stakeholder groups, and therefore you're better able to navigate a changing universe. So in that case, I think we can actually say this does relate to diversity, and incidentally, on the board composition, it's not just women. It's also diversity of background. I mean, you look at racial composition, et cetera, you have similar benefits that accrue. Some of the others, it's a little bit harder to say, and I will confess that I have doubts, for example, about the evidence relating to the lower levels of corruption for female elected officials. I understand they're perceived to be less corrupt, but I think that you need to do more longitudinal analysis to really see whether that sticks over time. I'm not convinced that when leaders become entrenched, and we can all name some female leaders who have become entrenched in various parts of the world, that you see any lower levels of corruption. So I think in some areas it's really suspect, whether or not it's about sort of marginalization and what results from marginalization, or whether it's actually about the difference diversity makes. Does that make sense? Yeah. You're all speechless. Either you've been convinced completely or I've turned you off entirely. Yeah. Here.
Hi, so I was in the class from
Yeah.
earlier today, but as we talked about, one of the things we learned about has been microfinance loans, and one of the studies we read showed that the loans weren't as effective for women's empowerment because the women were acting basically as a conduit for their husbands, and the husbands were really the ones controlling the loans. But programs that had like incorporated men into those development projects were more effective at women's empowerment. So what role do you think that the incorporation of men plays in development for women's empowerment?
I think it's incredibly important, and I think it's under-leveraged in the field. I think it's both under-leveraged in two different ways. I think that at the end of the day, you need all the male allies that you can get, because when you have men in positions of authority and power, you need them to be able to seed some of that and create space at decision-making tables and for women's empowerment. And so in that sense, it's certainly under-leveraged. I think it's also under-leveraged because people fail to understand, or it's not fail to understand, but fail to understand that families around the world operate in many similar ways, and that it's about a family unit and how that unit moves forward. And we talked earlier in class as well about how economic empowerment projects can either be a deterrent to domestic violence in the home, or they can exacerbate domestic violence in the home, depending on how you've implemented the project. And so the devil is always in the details. But the best way to tackle it is to bring all of the family and the community along in these conversations, and not to drop yourself in and make decisions about who is and is not getting resources. I think that there's also a lot to be said about the use of technology to help facilitate the process. So now the ability of women to do mobile banking, which makes their assets less visible, increases their power de facto, because all of their assets, what they're earning, what they're spending on, those become much more private choices for them. Now, obviously, secrecy within the family, here and everywhere else, is a challenge, but giving them that autonomy to make those decisions is a very important part of the process, and using technology to enable that decision-making by the woman can be super helpful. So, okay, great. Is there? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I wanted to ask two questions. One is, what is your sense of the term and its usefulness, gender mainstreaming, in terms of these structural changes? And is it outdated? Is it still useful? And the second one is, you talked a little bit about, and I've seen some of your writings, that this gender inclusion includes beyond women. It's women's empowerment, but it goes much beyond to gender identities and gender preferences. So when we do that, my sense is that we need to do it all together. But do you get a lot of pushback that let's do the women first, then we do the rest? And what's your take on how to actually do this kind of gender identity, gender inclusion mainstreaming?
So we were just talking about this earlier, the second question. So on the first question, it's a great question with regard to sort of this transformative agenda. And I think the answer is you have to do both. Because essentially what you're talking about when you're talking about gender mainstreaming is, do you need projects that are focused on women and girls that are separate? And do you need to focus on the issues related to gender within sector projects and programs? And the answer is you need both. Because what you're trying to do is close gaps in access, gaps in achievement, empowerment and everything else. And if you're going to bring the bottom up, you need to dedicate some resources to lifting up those who have been left behind. And that requires some degree of focus. At the same time, you do need to incorporate all of these issues into the work that you're doing in various sectors, because you can make all kinds of inadvertent mistakes that are disempowering if you're not incorporating it into programs. So, in the class this morning, we were talking about, when are you scheduling meetings? Are those meetings at times that are convenient for everybody? Are they in places that everybody feels comfortable entering into? Are there entrances that accommodate different groups within the population? Are they, if we're talking about a broader agenda, are they disability accessible entrances? Are we advertising the meetings that we're having in different ways, because we know that different groups within society receive and absorb information in different ways? So all of these small things are really about increasing and tuning your interventions to be aware of gendered and other norms within society, not assuming that every society, every family or community is like paper dolls that are cut out of the same paper, and recognizing that there are those differences. Now, so on the second question, it's a little bit of a tougher question, I think. And we were talking about it earlier because there are lots of groups, and actually the work that I'm doing right now is focused on diversity and inclusion more generally. So gender and women's empowerment, but also how do you bring in all these other groups within society? And I think that I think you do need to move all of them forward together, but I do think you need to develop a way to differentiate when and how you do that, because one size will not fit all. And I think that it's important to recognize that the reason we have all this data on gender and women's empowerment because that issue has led. And you now look, for example, at the LGBT movement. They've done some great analysis on economic costs of exclusion for those populations, modeled on the work that was done around women's empowerment and gender. And that's great. It should have that effect. It should help us get just as robust data sets and information as we have for those other populations. But if you think about all the different segments in society that are marginalized in one way or another, it becomes very difficult to move them all forward at equal pace and equal time. And so you have to make certain choices, and your choices may be based on a calculation of, there are lots of different decision rules for what your calculation is. It can be the number of people affected. It can be the ease with which you move a certain intervention forward. It can be the extent to which you're sure that whatever intervention you're putting in place is going to be successful. Those are all valid decision rules. I don't think we're going to be able to move entire populations forward in all areas simultaneously. But I think we can do a heck of a lot better than we've done to date. The other point I'd make, and then I know Dan had a question as well, is that what this data and what this field is very thin on is an examination of intersectionality. And so we don't really, women and men and everybody in society have multiple identities. And those identities mean that they have certain priorities that make it different. I am a woman, I'm a mom, I'm a mother of sons, I'm Jewish, I come from New York City. Those things, how I prioritize those, how that plays into who I am, and I could go on, has an impact on whether it matters. There are some of the activists for women's rights who are African Americans have said I feel the fact that the discrimination I face as a woman more than I feel the discrimination I face as an African American. So I choose to prioritize that. And these are really important questions. How marginalized are women with disabilities? Really, really marginalized. How marginalized are older women with disabilities? Extraordinarily marginalized. And so that's an area where we really are just beginning to pull that nuance into the analytical frame. So, sir.
Wonderful. So a little bit of a change of course, and if this is not the case study that you're most familiar with or up to date on now, just wave me off. But among the issues that keep me up at night are, one is Afghanistan, which seems to be maybe one of the most interesting laboratories in which gender issues have been engaged, certainly in some decades. And I was wondering if you wanted to just address that and say, what the stakes are, and in terms of getting a transition right, because if things go wrong, they'll go very, very wrong.
Yeah. So Afghanistan keeps me up at night as well. I was involved in Afghanistan and working with Afghan women from very, very early, sort of post-Taliban. And for those who are less familiar with the story, there were virtually no girls in school in Afghanistan under the Taliban. The girls that were in school were generally in the diaspora and in camps in Pakistan or elsewhere, or they were in secret schools that very, very courageous women had in their basements that they called sort of Quranic schools, and then taught them literacy skills and other things. And for the global community, but the U.S. government has provided a lot of the resources in Afghanistan. The story of Afghan women is a huge success, and we still have over 4.5 million women in school today in Afghanistan, which there's still a distance to go, but that's a huge difference from essentially zero. And there's an incredible group of women leaders who fought along with ethnic minorities to gain rights in the Constitution, which is now in play within the negotiations. And an incredible group of women who returned to Afghanistan from the diaspora to lead the charge and to try to move this agenda forward, in addition to women in the country. I visited Afghanistan, I'm trying to remember what year it was, but made me feel extremely old, but that's okay. I met with these women who were interns in ministries. They had been placed through a program when they finished Kabul University that they would go into ministries as interns. And they had been educated entirely post-Taliban. And it was such a joy to have these women talking about sort of the typical challenges every young professional faces. I'm tired of carrying tea. I want to use my accounting degree. I want to put all of this to work. And they're incredibly strong. In addition to which, the U.S. government, its only project for women that is in the hundreds of millions of dollars is a program to advance the standing of Afghan women. So with these negotiations, what we've seen is, first of all, a negotiation bereft of people who are in the Afghan government thus far. Also completely absent are any female representatives. And the Taliban have brought women to negotiations before. So the idea that you couldn't have a more inclusive process of negotiation is nonsense. The mediators set the rules, and the mediators can say who needs to be at the talks. We've had other problems in that regard in Afghanistan. The High Peace Council has female delegates, but whenever they go off to really, really important meetings, the female delegates are never chosen. We have women at the local levels, at the provincial levels, who are quite active as mediators and are doing actually a really wonderful job. And I met with a group of them, male and female, who were talking about the role of women in mediation at the local level. And they were most concerned about provincial level efforts being ignored in the national level negotiations, because they think that peace is really built at this provincial level. And that in fact, the statements with regard to how much territory the Taliban control are actually overinflated, and they're large swaths of geography with relatively few people. So I'm concerned, and I'll be frank, I'm concerned also that we're just bringing in, we tend to say, oh, we need people with experience, but that means we bring in all the same people. And I'm concerned that we're not really having much of a creative approach on behalf of the people of Afghanistan. And I think that if you looked, we did an analysis of the media coverage of Afghan women's issues in the immediate post-invasion phase, and there was extraordinary media coverage, never before seen. It was really Laura Bush who was driving this agenda. You don't have any of that volume of discussion around Afghan women or around Afghan citizenry in general in this political negotiation that's taking place in Afghanistan. And it appears as if the driving force is how do you get a minimum level of stability so that the U.S. can pull out. And I'm completely sympathetic to that position, that we shouldn't be there with troops forever. On the other hand, we've invested an extraordinary amount of time, labor, and financial resources to now pull out and risk rolling back a set of accomplishments that were exceptional in terms of girls' education, in terms of reductions in maternal and child mortality, in terms of the creation of local governance structures. I mean, there are plenty of criticisms that can be leveled against the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, and I can list them for you. But there's also plenty of good that was done, and a lot of people who are counting on us.
The case of Afghanistan is such a clear illustration of the importance of including women in the post-conflict processes and the whole women, peace, and security agenda. And I support the women, peace, and security agenda, and I support the work that we've done in terms of developing national action plans that other countries have done. The thing that worries me about it is that it rests on a vision of women as peacemakers. And that's a very narrow understanding of women and women's roles in society. There is empirical evidence to suggest that it's true, although I too have questions about the research on which that's based. But the concern I have is that we're also supposed to be promoting the equality of women within the military. And those two things seem to work at odds with each other. And so I just have concerns about that, and I wonder if you share those or think that those are valid.
So I think there's a lot of validity, particularly to the National Action Plan and the work right out of the gate. There were certain things that the National Action Plan didn't cover. And part of that was oversight, and part of that was that they weren't sort of front of mind at the time we were originally working on it. The two I can think of that are most obvious are the CVE and addressing violent extremism agenda and addressing global climate change as a security threat. But there are others that others could point out. So those are the two issues they didn't cover. The other thing that the National Action Plan in the U.S. didn't cover, which it does in other places, is any domestic agenda whatsoever. So we didn't look, the we is a royal we, I mean, I was one little cog in a process, but we didn't look at the issues relating to women in the U.S. military, for example. We didn't turn inward. Some National Action Plans actually do look inward. I don't think that everybody in that movement says that women are just peacemakers. I think that some people in that movement do, but I think a lot of people say that women are actors in peace and conflict, and we need to understand the multiple roles that they play, and we need to be able to work with them, advance those that are peacemakers, think about the different motivations and driving forces for them when they are not, and understand that the anatomy of conflict brings with it players of all stripes with different perceptions. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and I think the movement is not quite so unified in looking at it through one lens. And as they've played catch-up, there's been much more focus on women in the forces and what the implications are of that, in all kinds of ways, whether it is looking back at Afghanistan and how women provided critical information, the Afghan women just after the Kandahar prison break, or whether it's looking at the provincial reconstruction teams and the role of women in those. There's also now an entire body of work being developed on violent extremist women. and how to better understand their role in extremist movements and what drives them to be brought into these movements. So, so I think that I think it's become richer and more nuanced as a field for analysis than it perhaps was at the beginning. But there's also an entire piece which really is about, for example, how do you pay attention in humanitarian relief operations to the needs of women when we weren't providing, for example, the minimum service packages, we weren't even providing menstrual products. So we weren't even thinking at a most basic level about what are the needs of women in refugee camps. And that piece is kind of a neutral piece. I mean, it just says, meet people where they are and what their needs are. So that's what I hope that's helpful to you. The other thing I would say, Afghanistan is a sad case. Colombia is a really happy case. I mean, it's a peace accord that came to a successful conclusion. It was super inclusive. It brought in all kinds of groups. It built on the knowledge and role of women. They have been really, really important in carrying forward the transitional justice process. And it is one of the sole national peace processes to have succeeded in the recent past. So if you're looking for a good example, there are good examples. And the other thing I would say, last comment, because I know you have a question, and we're just about out of time, is that the anatomy of peace negotiations has changed a lot. And I'm working on a book right now with somebody who's very involved in the back channel work around negotiations. And she says, yeah, we focus a lot on these big national negotiations, but really the peacemaking at this point is done at a provincial and local level. These national negotiations often don't go anywhere. The parties splinter. They can't even agree on an agenda. They don't show up. That's what we recently had in Yemen. And that what you try to do is create governing zones in local areas on the ground. And that's been what's been going on for years in Syria, for example. Not that there aren't terrible spots with terrible violence and enormous civilian casualties, but there have been people working throughout this extended conflict, many of them women, to negotiate peace on the ground, even with ISIS forces. So there's a piece to this which is a little bit invisible, but really, really important.
Hi, thank you for your speech. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in the Bangladeshi case study, you referenced women empowerment efforts, and I was wondering if you could just talk more about what those look like, because I don't know if I fully understand how American aid workers go about getting these women to defy, very powerful cultural norms.
So, first of all, it's not asking them to defy powerful cultural norms, okay? When done well. It's about a few things, I would say. One, and I think it's a great question, one is about understanding what the real norms are within societies, because very often we are fed a narrative about a society which is not necessarily true to that society. So I'll give you an example. There was a lot of public opinion polling research. Now I'm going to get myself in trouble because we have an actual expert here, about opinions on gender issues in Yemen. And it asked them, can a woman run for office? Should a woman be able to run for office? And then it asked, would you vote for a woman who runs for office? And even in Yemen, which is pretty conservative, a majority of the population agreed that women should be allowed to run for office. When you followed that up to ask them whether you would vote for a woman, the number went way down. But you wouldn't have expected them even to say, sure, women can be educated, women can run for office, they can do all of these things. And so I think it's important first to think about who you're letting define the norms within a given society and look a little bit under that. I mean, even if we think about US society now, if we looked through one side of the prism, what the perception would be of norms and attitudes within the United States would be very different than if we looked through another side of the prism. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is allowing the space for local people to help move their own society when done well. So the Afghan women we're working with are providing support, the good product, we're providing support to Afghan leaders who are then working with imams and mullahs to create the space for progress within their own communities. We're not the ones doing it. And it's about how you create that space for local leaders and influencers to transform their own society and create an opportunity for them to move forward. And then the third piece of this that I would just mention, on the issue of Bangladesh, often it's providing a space for convening. So a lot of what I was doing when I was working particularly on women, peace, and security was work as a mediator. So we would bring together groups of women who were representatives of the fighting forces, right? So in Darfur, at some point it splintered. It was like 18 groups. We had women from all of the 18 or so groups came together. They were members of these rebel movements. They needed to craft their own agenda. My role was a neutral mediator. I provided a safe space for them to discuss together what they thought. It wasn't for me to have an opinion. I could provide them my knowledge of what happened in Colombia or what happened in Afghanistan or what happened in Uganda or elsewhere. I could bring that to them and present it to them. But at the end of the day, what I was doing was helping them have a civil conversation about what their shared agenda was. And in that sense, I was actually more useful than a Darfurian could be, because they would have made assumptions about a Darfurian. They had no assumptions about me. I was just trying to help them find their agenda. So I hope that's helpful in giving you a sense of some of the ways in which you can move this forward without trying to impose a set of values that are from outside. Yeah, absolutely. Final questions? Yeah?
Well, it doesn't have to be final.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit the level of inability of interagency cooperation within the government and perhaps like think tanks and NGOs, because you've served in all three of those capacities, to both inward looking domestically and in international space, kind of working on these issues.
So the answer is there's not a single answer to that. It varies enormously. So for example, the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security was actually an extraordinarily collaborative process. I mean, we met incessantly, it seemed, with the Department of Defense and the Department of State. If you look actually at the original plan, it then brought in all of these other departments and agencies, 1 million of them, to talk about what they could do to contribute to the National Action Plan. Actually, if we wanted them to do more, we would have brought them in earlier, but there's always this trade-off, how collaborative and how quickly do you move? And the more you bring in various sets of actors, the less quickly you're likely to move. I focused a lot on internal coordination, particularly within USAID, and then collaboration with State Department and DoD. State Department focused a little bit less on the internal piece, and they were more focused externally and within the space of negotiating processes around the world. It's not wrong, they're just judgments on how you move different processes forward. But I think that internal coordination is a big issue. So for example, when we did the gender-based violence strategy, the people who came to talk about the gender-based violence strategy from the Department of Defense did not know the people who had worked on the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security from the Department of Defense. Now, Department of Defense is special. It's enormous and impossible to draw an organogram ever. But it was a sign of these disconnects that exist. Important to the interagency process is a role for the National Security Council, and Dan can speak more about that. But I mean, at some point you get to equities and somebody needs to make a decision, and you also need to have somebody who's kind of a neutral convening space and who declares this to be a priority for the administration as a whole. Not solely on women, peace, and security, but even when I was doing climate change negotiations earlier, we had this, the State Department was the anchor for the work, but at some point when it came closer to the negotiations for Kyoto, the center of gravity then shifts to the White House. For civil society, we had a great relationship with civil society, but in fairness to others who were in government, I was from civil society, so they felt like they sort of got their person into a position, and I was incredibly blessed, right? I had been advocating for a National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, and then I was invited inside government to create it. It's a pretty rare phenomenon. What our position was, and Don used to say this, Steinberg, a lot, you guys in civil society, you need to hold us accountable for all these promises, right? That's the job you play. So the first is you want to agitate to get these policies in place, to get these people in key positions. and to move this agenda forward. And then you need, once you've got that, how are you holding the institutions of government accountable for moving it forward? There are big gaps, though, in civil society knowledge, and I'll give you one example. So we did the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, and then we did the Gender-Based Violence Strategy. And in then the budget, I can't remember the budget year, they put in an earmark for like $400 million for work on gender-based violence. It was some humongous amount of money in a time when all we were doing was passing continuing resolutions, which meant the budget was a straight line. So there was no new money. Now, I was at this fancy reception, and the people from civil society and the sort of gender-based violence community came running over to me, and they're like, look, isn't this great? We got you all this money for the implementation of this strategy. And I didn't know how to answer, because the reality was that as much as what they were trying to do was increase the availability of funding for a very worthy cause, it actually was only going to tie us into knots. Because what it meant was we were going to need to go through a whole attribution exercise to show how we were spending $400 million on gender-based violence, rather than actually getting an appropriation for $400 million additional dollars. So it's really important, if, for those of you who are interested in going out to work in civil society, to think these things through tactically, and to also consult with your allies in government to understand what it is that will actually move an agenda forward in the kinds of ways you're looking for it to move forward.
So if we limited to the universe of people who can be involved, those who understand the appropriations process, there would only be about 5 people left in the room, but never mind that. There's a revolution underway, and from my years in Washington, the revolution is really underway in some places. It seemed to me at the World Bank, at AID, and a number of different places. I guess, and we know what the obstacles are in the field, but I wanted to know what you think are the 1, 2, or 3 things we need to make sure that this is a successful revolution, in our lifetimes. So where are the big obstacles? What needs to be done? Set aside the administration of the moment.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is I don't think everybody needs to know about the appropriations process. What I think is for any of these movements to succeed, and it can be this movement, but it's any movement, you need to build a large coalition with people who have knowledge of different things. And that if you don't really build that kind of a broad coalition there, you're going to have blind spots. And so you move at your own peril. So that was really what I intended to say with regard to appropriations. So I think there's a long to-do list, but I would name 4 things. I think the first is there's a really important need to push to increasingly empower and work with and through local organizations. Because, to the earlier question about who are we to go in and work in these societies, we're not. What we should be, our rightful role is to elevate the voices within those societies to move this agenda forward. And our record is atrocious on that. There was some data, it's very, very dated, so don't quote me, but there was an analysis by a great organization that no longer exists that the money that had been set aside for Afghan women was 0.07% of that was going to Afghan women-led organizations. 0.07%. So we have a huge road to travel to really enable these movements to progress on their own. The second is, I think that we really do need to increase the flow of funds, particularly in a post-conflict environment. And the reason for that is I've seen firsthand that we make all kinds of commitments at these donor conferences after conflict is over, and then we pay no attention to what the needs assessments say. And I was at the two of the donor conferences for Sudan. And the first one, they presented all the data and what the needs were and the gaps and the terrible situation of women and girls. And then we all came back 6 years later, and they presented the same numbers essentially. Nothing had moved, and the disbursement of funds was delayed, and nobody really cared what the needs assessment said. They were all focused on bureaucracy. So I think that's a second thing. I think we also. This is still relatively young. We don't have all these answers. So I mentioned earlier the focus on humanitarian relief operations, and that's actually been an area where there's been a lot of attention and goodwill to move this agenda forward. But how do you, and in particular, how do you reduce gender-based violence rates in relief operations? So in displaced persons camps, when you're rescuing people from floods and storms, and how do you move that forward? And yet we haven't succeeded. So I was with the British Foreign Secretary at the time when Typhoon Haiyan hit in the Philippines. And she called it, we were there for we were there for this gender-based violence summit that William Hague had organized, who was the British foreign minister at the time. And so she quickly pulled the major donors into a meeting to talk about, okay, this is our opportunity. We all happen to be here together. We're actually talking about gender-based violence. Let's do all of the recommendations we have for how to combat gender-based violence in the aftermath of this storm. And we did, and it was better, but it still wasn't great. And so there's a lot of space to really develop better solutions that we don't yet have all the answers to. And then I think the other important thing is that we have to build the database of projects that show the with and without case. Because, I can point to my example from Bangladesh, but I need to struggle to come up with 3 others that really give you sort of the before and after and what the implications are. And that is unbelievable gold in terms of making the case to people who think women's empowerment and girls' empowerment is a good thing, but really need it justified in terms of project dividends and what it is they're delivering. So I think those, from a sort of academic and scholarly perspective, are extremely important. In terms of the challenges, so I don't think, the numbers I presented are pretty dire. I mean, that is, there's a very long way to go before we're pushing up against a lot of opposition. But I've seen myself that when it starts to get to be a zero-sum game, the opposition comes out very, very quickly. We've talked about, with mediators, about saying, well, when you're inviting people to talks, because the mediator issues a letter and says, please come to these peace talks, and you need to name 7 representatives. Sometimes in the letter, the mediator sends, and we'd appreciate if you would have some females among your delegation. Often not. Given the 2.4% statistic, more often not than yes. I said, well, why don't you say you can have 5 representatives come to negotiations, but you can have 7 if you bring 2 women, right? Or you can have 5, but you can only have 3 if you're only bringing guys. That becomes very contentious very quickly, because you're actually taking something away from somebody who thought they had a seat at the table, and suddenly they didn't. So I don't know, we can keep going on, but I can also end on a personal story. My son is an undergraduate at Harvard, and he tried out for Hasty Pudding. And this year, Hasty Pudding went co-ed. So whereas it used to be 12 boys, this year it was 6 boys and 6 girls, which meant he's very into theater. So which meant that if it had been 12, he would have likely gotten in. He calls me and says, Mom, it's co-ed this year, so there is 1 slot for a boy, because once you're in, you're in. He did not get the slot. And so he called me and said, yeah, I did not get the slot. There was 1 for a boy. That boy is not me. And I said, well, what do you think? And he said, look, if it's in the cause is gender equality, I will give them my slots. But there are very few people who will say that. And so that's where, when rubber meets road, that's when you get a lot of this opposition. And I think that, frankly, requires a lot of male allies to be willing to stand up and say, no, this is more important. And you saw this actually in Afghanistan. In some of the round of jirgas, not in this immediate period, but in earlier rounds of jirgas, women were making, jirgas are these local big council meetings to make decisions that are the traditional Afghan method for decision making. And they had been getting an increasing share of women in the jirgas, and usually they were in the back and they were marginalized and whatever. At some point when they broke up into committees for the jirgas, they started electing I don't know if it's called the president and vice president, but let's call it that. And the presidents were all men, and then some man stood up and said, no, I think we need 1 female vice president and 1 male vice president. And that created the space for other men to agree, and they moved forward with it. And so part of it is this issue of how do you animate these voices that really are dying for progress within their own societies, and they need those spaces created for them to speak up. And I think that until we get more of that, we'll make progress, but it will really be very much incremental progress. So, thank you.